Now it's time to introduce the buffalo alcohol torch, which is a little bottle that I filled with flammable liquid. It has a wick and a little metal arm that blows air on the flame when we squeeze the bottle. We're going to use this tool to melt the clay and create interesting textures that we couldn't achieve without the use of such a tool. Sometimes the wick gets too burnt and you have to disassemble the bottle and pull more fresh wick out. This helps the wick light properly again and burn without issues. The alcohol that the bottle is filled with is some sort of flammable liquid meant for cooking out in nature, I believe. So the reason you use something that's meant for cooking is because it won't create as much soot, and soot just gets on your sculpture and, turns it to a bit of a charcoaly mess. So that's why you use that type of flammable liquid. I'm not entirely sure what's in here. I think it's perhaps denatured alcohol or something called red spirits, but I can't really remember what I put in there. The reason I use this tool, which is manual of course and a bit more tricky to work with, compared to a kitchen blowtorch like one you would use to burn your creme brulee with, is that this tool burns much slower and it's easier to control the melting of the clay. Oil-based clay does melt, which is why this trick works of course, but it can also be burnt if you melt it too quickly or too much. If you melt it way too much, you can also destroy more of your surface than what you intend to destroy, and you can sort of melt the whole sculpture apart. A small butane torch for kitchen work would also do wonders here, but tread lightly when using such tools because they do melt the clay really fast. The manual Buffalo alcohol torch, and that's a brand name I believe, is very helpful since it's slow and doesn't affect the clay surface that much when we use it. This allows me to control the effects that I'm having on the clay. If you wanted to move more quickly from a soft surface to a firm surface when using such a tool, you would need something to cool the clay down with quickly. While I'm not going to do it here, what you could do is use a spray can with air, which is often sold to help clean electrical components like computers and stuff, and you can turn it upside down when spraying. This will spray out a very cold spray, which will freeze the clay firm immediately. Now, I'm too slow-paced and Italian these days for such tricks. I'll just go get a cappuccino while the clay goes back to its original state. So I won't be using that tool today, but that's a good trick that you can keep in your back pocket. Depending on your clay, you might find different results using a technique such as this. Not every oil-based clay is going to be formulated the same way, and some of them melt at very different temperatures and in very different ways than others. Some go very liquid very fast, and others turn sort of gooey before turning into a liquid. Definitely do some testing before trying this at home and melting your entire sculpture off the armature into a puddle. This trick will only work on oil-based clay or wax. Water-based clays will only dry out, of course, but perhaps there are some fun tricks there that could be possible to try out, like some crackling effect or something like that. But I haven't experimented much with this tool on water-based clay just yet, so I'm not really sure. When we rake, we go across the forms. Doing this is key to making sure that what we've done before continues to stay evident, and that we simply affect the surface mainly and not the underlying anatomy and forms. Exactly why this is the case, I'm not entirely sure, but in general it seems that raking across the forms allows us to maintain what came before and simply clean it up a bit, as opposed to raking with the forms, which seems to ruin what we've done before. From a rendering perspective, we've seen similar techniques deployed by draftsmen using pen and ink for hundreds of years, and continue to see this very similar technique even in modern media like comic books and manga. Take a look at most comic and manga artists working today, and their rendering technique is going to rely heavily on this type of cross-hatching, which travels across the form, and you can see the same thing in unfinished marble sculptures by Michelangelo. It doesn't only work in drawing, of course, but also in sculpture. If you wanted to leave your sculpture with visible rake marks, and I do think that's a valid choice as far as finish goes, then making sure that the rake marks have some rhyme or reason to them and frankly look good is important. You can test it out yourself and see which pattern of rake marks you prefer to leave behind, and I'm willing to bet that most of you is going to choose a pattern where the rake marks travel across the forms. Reason for this is that across the form helps accentuate the surface anatomy and the volume that we've worked hard to establish, and raking against the form sort of buries it and makes it impossible to see, makes it hard to comprehend. Even though I don't plan on leaving this sculpture with visible, very visible rake mark texture, at least not in a lot of places, I think it's still much more beneficial for us to rake against the form and not with the form. The final surface texture of your sculpture is all about choice. What dictates that choice can be many factors, of course. Certain sculptures sort of demand a certain kind of finish, and some other sculptures will demand a very different kind of finish. There are few rules other than the ones you decide for yourself in this realm. My choices are usually going to be based on subject, so if I'm sculpting someone really old, I'm much less likely to make a smooth texture. The texture can do some of the heavy lifting in terms of telling a story of somebody older with more wrinkles. Concept or story/idea can also be something to consider when deciding on the surface texture. Famously, Night by Michelangelo is polished to an almost mirror finish to reflect the moonlight and appear cold and dark, as compared to her counterparts in the room in the chapel with a slightly less polished finish. There are also theories which revolve around the high polish finish being a way of suggesting night sweats from nightmares, though she seems to be sleeping rather calmly for a nightmare to be taking place in my opinion, so I don't know. I find ideas like this to be very fascinating, though a lot of these theories seem perhaps a bit far-fetched sometimes. The idea of finish being part of the concept and helping say what you want to say, that's a very cool idea and something that's perhaps a valuable tool to keep in the toolbox as well.